Hello and welcome to Skeleton Songs.
They put some stuff in me and now I don't feel that well.
That's a very frightening opening, so to explain...
It wasn't a face hugger, it was just some RNA.
Yeah, this is not the set of Alien. Everything's fine. Although actually quite an interesting opening about our episode today on antagonists and villains.
Yes.
The antagonist and villain of Alien is...
Is it Alien?
It is the Alien, yes, congrats. It's a very simple equation in the Alien franchise. That's why it works so well.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? That the villain and the antagonist is what it's named for. Whereas if, for example, you're watching Shaft, then the hero and the protagonist is what it's named for.
Yes, but then...
It's not very interesting.
But, you know, it's a thing, and we've got some time to fill, so good job.
Oh, my God, quality entertainment. Anyway, antagonist and villain. Tell me the difference, Lottie Byrne.
Well, the basic difference is that antagonist forms a primarily mechanical function. It's there essentially to make trouble for the protagonist, and that can be anything from somebody who actually tries to do them harm, or a good person who otherwise betrays them or just gets in the way, or even something as sort of impersonal as a wave or a storm or you know, I don't know, a breakdown in your car when you're trying to get to the location you want to get to.
A fly. I've read at least one short story and or seen at least one episode of The Twilight Zone where somebody's trapped in a room with a fly, which...
drives them mad. Yeah, that's a great example. So an antagonist doesn't have anything intrinsically bad about them. They're just something that causes trouble and therefore creates drama and an interesting story for the viewer, the reader, or the player. A villain, by contrast, is something that is kind of intrinsically bad. And this has fallen out of favour because I think more modern audiences are less interested in good and bad as concepts. We don't have goodies and baddies anymore, although I know that you laugh at me because I'm one of the few people you've met who continue to use the term goodie and baddie. And we're now more interested in nuanced characters, people who you know, you might say is a bad person because they do lots of bad things, but we're no longer kind of interested in the tropes of like the witch, the wicked witch, she's just bad, she lives in a cave.
I completely disagree with that.
Oh, God damn it.
No, I think
but I was going so well.
So,
and you with your rewards for writing and you come in here and you have an opinion.
So, sure, if you read that D&D book you like.
I am going to have a word with you off air about
this. This is Beowulf.
This is allegedly Beowulf.
Beowulf, then, you know, so Grendel, actually, you know, even there, Grendel's got some I was
going to say, actually, it's incredibly nuanced and complicated, and it's all a big metaphor.
He's not,
so shut up.
Sure, it's a big metaphor, but he's got some sympathetic features, but he's basically a big, scaly thing.
No, he doesn't have sympathetic features, but the story overall...
Well, he's lonely.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah. But basically, he's an embodiment of chaos, isn't he?
Yeah,
in some sense.
Yeah.
So he's about as straightforward a villain as you can get, and he wants to cause harm. So you get that. But I think if you go to you go to Netflix and you pick a show at random, then there's a good chance it'll have a villain who is less complex than Beowulf. Doctor Who.
True.
So
here we are.
Probably
you know, accidentally referring to good art,
yeah,
rather than modern art.
But the point is that the modern day doesn't have any kind of unique license or nuance, although sometimes you like to think we have. And I was going to say, you know, Doctor Who ranges from the you know, it's the most mainstream example of entertainment that sometimes attempts nuance that I can think of. Daleks are not nuanced, but sometimes they put nuance in them. But you basically want somebody who can go boo when it's on the screen, especially with a show like Who, where it's intended to be children friendly as well.
Yeah.
You don't want anything too complicated. I remember when my daughter was like 7, having conversations with her about whether that man was really bad in the show, or whether he had some sort of motive, and she was like, "No, he's bad." She's
just a bad person, Dad.
And similarly, you know, pick any playwright taught on an English syllabus, all the way back to the Greeks, and you will find some nuance in people who might reasonably be described as villains and could certainly be described as antagonists. So
okay, I take it back. A palpable hit.
Sorry.
No, that's good. I suppose you've been an antagonist for my conversational control. Good role play.
But the villain thing, the etymological factoid, of course, is that the villain...
It's classist.
It's classist. It comes from villain, meaning a serf, and the idea was that if you were a serf, you would do base things, you know, like robbery and rapine, that a knight wouldn't. And I think, you know, if
that's been borne out.
Yeah, rich people don't do bad things, you know.
I mean, I can't think of a single person, no.
No. I mean, obviously, you know, the first generation, they might do bad things, but then after they've had nobility bred into them, they stop doing bad things.
Thank God for blood.
But that, I think, is the thing, is that villains are usually the outgroup, and whether the outgroup is that tribe over there with a different name, who to historians are quite hard to tell apart, or impossible to tell apart because they're all buried in the same mass grave, or that country over there with a different flag. I remember reading about a Chinese dude who refused, I'm not sure how seriously, to believe that English and German were distinct languages.
Really?
Because because they're very similar languages, right? English is a West Germanic language.
Yeah.
You've got a lot of crossover, both via the Germanic stuff and via Old Norse. And if you're coming from Chinese, they're really similar. And,
that's what I mean. It was a genuine assertion. It wasn't some sort of ideological stand.
As far as I can tell, yes. I mean, but that's the thing. And the idea, if you're coming from that position, that the stereotypical villain in the English-speaking world is a German-speaking villain must be quite hard to understand. In the same way that if you're coming from the English-speaking world, then trying to get your head round the fundamentals of the Romance of Three Kingdoms and knowing who the villains are, when they're basically all monosyllabic names that sound to an English speaker quite a lot like other Chinese names, is also very difficult. But it's the outgroup. So if you're rich, the poor people are bad. If you're poor, the rich people are bad.
Yeah.
If you're being Marxist inflected in your storytelling, then you've probably got a factory owner in a black hat.
Yeah.
And again and again, in politics, in drama, on social media, we see people reduced to caricatures of the outgroup. Well, that was a bit more serious than I meant to sound.
Well, no, I was going to say, actually, this is leads me to a hobby horse of mine, which is psychology, really. I'm a massive armchair psychologist, and I basically should have done that with my life, but I didn't. And I'm in games, and you guys have to deal with it. And I read a book recently by Simon Baron-Cohen, not to be confused with Sacha Baron Cohen, who is the famous actor.
And she's his nephew or something.
Nephew, yeah, I believe. And Simon Baron-Cohen is a famous psychologist who I believe is the head of the autism department at some really impressive university like Yale or Cambridge or something. And he wrote a book called 0 Degrees of Empathy, where he talks about a bunch of psychological factors that go into personality disorders and individual acts that seem to have an unusual lack of empathy, which ultimately is a starting point for understanding villainous activity. The classic, the classic and the worst being, the Nazis. And there's lots of things have been written about how did normal people be involved with that, because it wasn't, everyone wasn't a Hitler. Most people were, John from next door who did something atrocious, and you think, how did that happen? And one of the things that Simon Baron-Cohen says as something that erodes empathy and allows people to do things that otherwise we wouldn't think are good acts that we wouldn't normally do, is the sense that they're in the out group. So the kind of sense of tribalism, the sense that I'm not really doing it to someone that is my group, that's a good person, because my group is always the good group. Because few people would openly acknowledge, oh no, I'm a bad person, that's cool. Most people would try to justify their actions. But if it's someone other, either because of their race or ethnicity, or because of an act that they did in the past, or because where they live, or whatever it is, so it's kind of easier just to do something a bit mean to them. So it doesn't explain, why somebody would suddenly go from being a perfectly normal functioning person to doing something grotesque. But it's one of many factors that go into becoming a villain, I suppose. And I think that's particularly significant when we talk about villains in games and antagonists, because of course we have a complicated illusion in a game where the player is actually very complicit in the actions that are taken in a game. So we're not going to talk much about this, but this is why Nazis is such a popular trope, because if you have a game where primarily you're shooting people, you don't want the player to constantly feel guilty about murdering people and think about their families and their sad mums and whatever. But if you say, well, we shoot the Nazis, then everyone goes, great, Nazis were terrible, so I have no guilt about shooting them because I'm saving the world from Nazism, right? Which is kind of popular. And
I think that's true. I think that there's a bit more to it than that. So the reason I think we've fixed on bad guys is because I wrote a column for Eurogamer, which we'll probably link to, so going through a lot of historic material about whether punching Nazis, when punching Nazis is a helpful thing to do, and when it's not a helpful thing to do. And it is generally a satisfying thing to do, but it can sometimes be a counterproductive thing to do. In video games, it's always a satisfying and a productive thing to do. Because in video games, largely speaking, if there's a Nazi in a video game, it's one of a finite number of Nazis between you and the end of the level. And if you reduce the number of Nazis to 0,
then you win.
Then you can reach the end of the level, and that's good. And you can reload, and Nazis can't reload. So unless you're playing, I spent some happy hours in that Nazi zombie army game that Sniper Elite people make.
Oh yeah.
Where the zombies respawn, but
that's not cool.
It's not cool. But the other thing about Nazis is their branding is great. You know,
they do have consistent branding,
right? And I think that did they get like I'm not shaming Hugo Boss because most countries in Germany in the 1930s had something to do with the Nazis, but I think like the creative director of Hugo Boss designed the SS uniform or something.
Somebody properly.
So and this is obviously one of the reasons that Nazis remained a good costume, because those great coats
they are memorable, and they do, yeah.
But as I think I said in the article, so to be clear, I'm not in favour of Nazism, and I recognise
where the factory does not support Nazism,
their extreme fashion sense and its enjoying popularity, without in any way endorsing their almost uniquely and uniformly horrible ideology. But the Force... Have you heard of the Force Publique?
No.
The Force Publique was the auxiliary military corps of King Leopold of Belgium in the Belgian Congo. And you have heard of King Leopold.
I have. I was born in Belgium, ladies and gents, so I feel... I'm not Belgian, but I do feel slightly guilty about how awful Leopold of Belgium was to basically everyone, particularly the Congolese.
So the Force Publique killed... I can't remember now without looking at my notes.
They were the Belgian Colonial Army, I'm assuming.
They were. I think they were auxiliaries. They were recruited mostly from the local population.
Oh, grim.
And given guns and told to shoot people. Well, they shot a lot of people. I think it was about 250,000. It was certainly a number with a million in it. But if you
in the Congo.
In the Congo, yes.
Oh my god.
But
this is sort of happy reading we've been doing in lockdown.
But nobody knows who the hell they are. So if you put a Force Publique guy in a video game, people will say he's got a fez on. What's the fez? But everybody knows what a Nazi looks like. Death. Same thing with Mao and Stalin, who if you had a leaderboard for atrocities in the 20th century, those two and Stalin would be in the top 5.
Yeah.
And you could have
the axis of evil,
unproductive argument about which one belongs at the top. But nobody knows what how Berry addressed. I don't think many people could name many Soviet organisations at the time. There's the KGB and everybody can name the Gestapo, the SS and whatnot. And same with China. People know that Mao wore boiler suits, but there's no branding in Western Europe that people
I hadn't thought of that, but I think you're right, because it's such an easy reference point to make, that it's both sort of inarguably bad, and of course there are some sort of people who pretend that it's not, but they're silly. And that's basically what I have to say about that. Yeah. So everyone knows that they're bad, and then everyone can recognise them. And I hadn't really thought about how powerful that is, because I was thinking earlier about the stereotypes and the proper stereotypes again that are now pretty gross. So one of the classics, of course, is the very anti-Semitic trope of the kind of evil Jew, which maybe it's not a surprise that that's also linked to Nazism. But the classic kind of stereotype of the evil Jew has a bunch of defining characteristics that, again, at the time everyone was supposed to recognise as this means that this person is that person, and therefore that kind of makes you immediately assume a bunch of negative characteristics. In the same way that a trope of a witch is usually a sort of ugly old woman. We don't like them. We have no time for ugly old women in society, and she's probably a bit mean, and I bet she pretends to be sexy to make a man want to have sex with her, and then she's not. There's some sort of classic assumptions that as soon as you say something like the Wicked Witch, or the miserly Jew or the Nazi, everyone immediately goes, right, I know exactly where those people are, and I'm not worried about my moral relationship to those people, except of course the anti-Semitic thing now we're super not pro. But I think the Wicked Witch is still probably in good stead.
I think,
and I hadn't thought about how just powerful as a symbol the Nazis are.
Because everybody knows, and also because there has been an entirely understandable desire on the part of the UK and America to centre the Second World War in our respective national mythologies.
Yeah.
Because we
for once we were sort of on the right side.
Well, that's the thing. Both our countries done a lot of things that we could reasonably be ashamed of or not proud of. And although in the Second World War, bombing Dresden was horrible.
That was pretty bad.
And nobody behaved with total grace in the Second World War. I think everybody in the world is probably broadly glad that the Allies rather than the Axis won the Second World War. It was a war of the democracies against the totalitarians. Yeah, and it's very rare to have a conflict, especially such a bloody and horrible one, in which the moral scales are so clearly tilted one way rather than the other. So we amp up that. Whereas if you say, if you want to talk about Stalin, for example, then Stalin was Britain and America's ally ultimately against the Germans, and the reason, it's easy to forget this now, that Orwell wrote Animal Farm was because he was frustrated by the constant pro-Soviet propaganda, not just from the left, and Orwell obviously was sort of inclined to be left-wing, but constantly at war with the left wing, but from the establishment. The British government didn't want people making a fuss about the Russians, who remained important allies. And I said the 50s, I think it was the late 40s, really. But
and that's why I think we've globbed onto this in games, because there are some games which are deliberately setting out to say something challenging, like Orwell. So I was talking to a friend the other day about Disco Elysium, and my friend had said that he really enjoyed playing it, but he didn't find it like necessarily a super fun experience, even though he really enjoyed it, because it's a really complicated, interesting, brilliant RPG where everybody is a bit complicated. There isn't a clear divide between the protagonist and the antagonist. I mean, there's a player character and you like them, but it's not like the player character is a wonderful, there's a lot of games I can think of that have like a 6-year-old girl as a protagonist, and basically you'd have to work pretty hard as a narrative designer to make an audience think that the 6-year-old female protagonist of a game is in any way bad, right? Because they're young and they're sweet and they're nice and they're innocent and they probably win. So tick 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 tick. Whereas Disco Elysium isn't like that. But most games, I think, are played for fundamental entertainment and for relaxation, and therefore people want to play a game without being morally challenged all the time, because in our daily life we have it's nothing but a litany of constant moral decisions. Do you get that bagel that you fancy because you're a bit hungry, or do you give that money to a charity to help people that you'll never meet across the world? Do you walk past that man on the street who's asking for money, or do you decide that you're going to stop and help them? Do you decide you're going to stop and help them, and then remember that you read something from shelter saying please don't give money to people on the street? I'm really conflicted by that. I always give money to people on the street because, as you know, my brother spent some time living on the street and he's out of skips, and so I don't. I just don't feel like I can, even if they want to spend it on alcohol, that's ultimately their business. I was in Little Clarence Street in Oxford once, and a guy came up to me and said, "I know this story, sir. Do you have £10,000?" And I said, "I'm sorry, no." He said, "All right. How about 50 pence for a cup of tea then?" I would absolutely give him 50 pence. Obviously I gave the 50 pence. The Irishman. How much money he deserved. They're the power. We should be very cautious of the Irish. But what a pitch. What a pitch. It's very good. Classic Ancrete. Anyway, I think, first of all, you're right about simplicity. And one of the... I don't mean to demean games. I just mean that... I'm about to go on demean games. Oh, fantastic. So first of all, I was going to say, one of the features of authoritarianism and fascism and demagoguery generally is to simplify. So the rallying cry. So boo is like the important thing to say, but the rallying cry. I will be taking the role of the mindless mob in this conversation. Boo. The rallying cry of the authoritarian is very rarely. It's a little bit more complicated than that. Yes. It's these people are bad. We are good. You are good. Let's get rid of the bad people. That's basically what it comes down to. Yep. Sometimes it means setting fire to them all, and sometimes it means voting them out. Yeah. And the one is easier to endorse than the other.
but I think, especially in the 21st century, even before that, life is complicated. It's really reassuring to have somebody who says, if you just get rid of the bad people, it'll be okay. Aren't they awful? And the defining feature is they're not like us. The other thing about games is, and this I've said this from time to time, and I think it's probably my most contentious, strongly held opinion. If you want nuance, games are not the place to go looking for it. Now, let me qualify that contentious point.
Apart from our games, which are brilliant.
Some games have... Well, first of all, you don't need to be brilliant to have nuance in.
Okay, but our games are brilliant and everyone should buy them.
And
just
secondly...
to be clear on that point.
Well, there's only one of them at the moment.
All of the... Look, who's the marketing director?
Just buy your tarot, because it's great.
And why am I the marketing director when you're constantly undermining your own stuff?
Because art is hard. Nuance... so obviously there are games with nuance. We're just talking about Disco Elysium, which is swampy with nuance. And
but it is a standout.
And I say that with love. It was my game.
I know. I remember you playing it, and you kept sort of sitting back from the screen and going, sort of making horse noises, going, "This is very good."
It is very good, but it's
yeah, like that.
Well, it's very good in the way that an average Kingsley Amis novel is very good.
That's really mean.
But it's also not, because Kingsley Amis was a brilliant writer. But that's the thing. The best writing, and I say this unhesitatingly, Disco Elysium is the best written game that has ever graced the PC. I don't play games with those boxes that sit on the TV, so maybe there's better written games on that. But they mostly don't have words in, so probably not. And Disco Elysium is unlikely to win... Robert Kurtzman is now? Okay. The Nobel Prize for Literature.
Yeah. Because
if you are playing a game rather than reading a book, you are going to be interested in the gameplay and the other stuff, as well as the writing.
There's a lot of such distracting from a lot of the nuance.
Yeah. Well, not just distracting, but like also present. So one analogy is, if you are watching a film, then absolutely lots of films have brilliant screenplays and the dialogue is what makes it. But there's a lot of other features in the film. So if you really want good words, what you'll probably do is go to a book or maybe a play. If you're really looking for rich language, poetry, films sometimes have great language, but it's not their main point. It's not the raison d'être. And similarly, if you really want a subtle, interesting, challenging meal, you're not going to go to a patisserie, because basically everything tastes good if you put enough sugar in it.
Yeah.
Everything tastes good if you fry it. And games tend to be the patisseries and the fried food of the creative world. And again, don't get me wrong, I spend as much time or more playing games than I do reading books, and I've devoted my life to it, and I think lots of really interesting stuff. But we've got this permanent bug up our bum about how games are an evolving medium, and someday they're going to be taken as seriously as books. And I think that's quite a big ask if you want interesting gameplay in the games as well. I think the promised land where games are treated with the same gravitas as entries to the Turner Prize is always going to be just over the horizon. And thank fucking Christ. But that's my contentious opinion. I'm done.
And how does that relate to villains and antagonists?
I can't remember. Nuance.
That you're now an antagonist of the
No, it was something to do with nuance. Did I mention I have a head cold?
That was it. That was that I proposed that games often don't want that much nuance because the player often comes to games as a relaxing entertainment activity in the same way you go and see a sort of very popular Marvel film rather than going to see some hard-hitting Polish art house black and white 5-hour long exploration of child slavery, but which is a fundamentally different experience in the same medium. So often you'll find that either there is no villain at all. Like I was thinking about the games that I play, and actually finding a villain or finding a kind of very specific antagonist is quite hard. So my games of choice, as I'm sure I've said before, is sort of RPGs, basically any kind of RPG. And the last villain I think I've run into was Alexios or Cassandra in the Assassin's Creed Odyssey franchise, depending on which character you pick. And even that wasn't really a villain. You had this sort of group of cultists who very much were bad people who you just got to sort of mindlessly murder and feel good about afterwards because they were just like inarguably bad people. But the actual primary antagonist that pushed the drama along and pushed the narrative along turned out to be extremely sympathetic. So they're not a villain, even though they've done very villainous things. And ultimately at the end, spoiler, you do have an option to reconcile and to not have any antagonist at all, which is interesting. And I just think, if you gave your average player the chance, the choice of, do you want there to be strife and discord in the world, or would you like everyone to get along and have flowers? Most people would say, well, if I really were God and could just clip my fingers, I'd like everyone to get along, please. I don't really need an antagonist or a villain. And CF, the entire Pokemon franchise, and the rise of the wholesome game, where people want to bugger around in pixel farms and plant carrots and be nice to people. And those games are hugely successful for a reason. It's not that people are stupid and they can't deal with nuance, or that they don't want to go and see 5-hour black and white Polish films about child slavery. It's that there's something inherent in games where people go to kind of relax and have a lovely place. You look like you have an opinion.
I do. Well, you've surfaced something for me, which is that I don't know which. I think there are fewer villains and fewer visible antagonists in games than there used to be. I think there's been a big growth in games where you build things over the last few years for a variety of reasons, whether that's RimWorld or Stardew Valley, or sort of incremental and free-to-play games on your mobile. And I think some of that is the growth of different business models. So, for example, incremental games as a genre couldn't have existed before we had mobile devices. And incremental games they're not a good home for villains, because you basically want to see a number go up very slowly over time in a satisfying way. So you don't need a villain in the same way. And I think also a lot of video game stories, most video game stories to begin with, drew from screenwriting and screenplay, and particularly from the American tradition of screenplay, the sort of Robert McKee, 5 acts. You have to have an arc and an antagonist, and or sort of post-Campbellian stuff. And I remember during some contract work I did a few years ago for a big AAA dev, being in a room when somebody took apart somebody else's treatment on the basis that there wasn't an antagonist in it. And
Really?
Yeah. I mean, they were...
Was that because they worried that the drama wouldn't unfold quickly?
I think so I was a relative newbie in the room, so there may have been nuances I didn't get, and I don't remember that clearly. But my impression was that the person who was taking apart the treatment came from a screenwriting background.
Gotcha.
And they felt, you need to tick these things.
Yeah.
And it was a bit different.
Yeah.
And I think you get basically two kinds of both antagonists and, well, certainly antagonists and probably villains in games. You get the cinematic ones, you get the gameplay ones. So if you're playing Bioshock, Andrew Ryan is a cinematic one, and
I was going to say with the Joker in the Batman games, will also be a cinematic one, because if you die,
you basically get somebody
who makes you cross,
who shows up on monitors and shouts at you,
yeah.
And you may have some sort of relationship with as a character, which is often very entertaining and effective, and then you'll probably have some boss fights, and you'll probably face them in the end. And the boss fights are nearly always letdowns. Because
I don't like boss fights.
I don't like boss fights. Nobody does. The thing about boss fights, I think, is they're you have to have something there.
Yeah.
So you have a boss fight, and ideally what you'd have is some sort of continuation of the experience you've been having with the guys appearing on the monitors and taunting you or whatever. But it's very hard to do that in a game context. And I think that's okay. There's problems with forms, and those problems often are patched with non-ideal solutions that we've learned how to deal with them. But I've ground to a halt. I can't remember if I was making a better point than that.
Well, you said I'd shaken something loose for you, but I think...
Oh yes, I think there's fewer antagonists in games now, because again the stereotype of video games in the 1980s and I guess 90s, which long since stopped being true, was they're basically games where you have a gun or a spaceship and you shoot people. And there's still lots of those. I quite enjoy playing a lot of them, but they're not the thing anymore. Did I tell you about my ex-wife watching me play Bioshock?
No.
So my ex was not a geek.
She's very arty, isn't she?
She's very arty,
like
classy arty, very film buffy.
Yes.
And she's from a country which very much takes seriously still or did when she was growing up, the distinction between high art and low art. And I was playing the opening of Bioshock, which for those of you who need your memories refreshing who haven't played it, involves you crashing at sea, and then in a sort of a submersible, you're taken over rise, and you see this wonderful city outlined in neon lights, like sort of underwater 1920s New York.
It's so pretty.
Which has been built at the bottom of the ocean. Wonderful,
it's still
wonderful
pretty.
scene. And I called Anna in to see it. And normally I'd call her in to look at games, and she'd be like, what nerd nonsense is this you're visiting on me now? She was transfixed, and she said...
Was she?
Yeah. She said, my God, it's like Metropolis meets The Matrix, which isn't a bad way of describing the opening of Bioshock.
No.
And then... So there's voiceover stuff, and then you pass through the city, and there's a whale, and it's all great, and then you dock, and then so we docked, and I'd reloaded to the beginning of the game to show Anna, and I started to reload my later game, and Anna said, "No, keep playing." But she wanted to see more of it, so you play through the next bit, which involved some sort of scripted drama and cutscene stuff, and then I get out, and the first thing you actually do once you are free, once you get out of the submersible, because you want to move your point around, is pick up a wrench.
Yeah.
And the second thing you do is this dude attacks you and you beat him to death with a wrench.
And she didn't like that.
And yeah, well, she sort of recalled, and she said, "Oh, is it all like that?" And I said, "Well, kind of, because."
So what was it that had transfixed her?
It was the visuals. It was looking at the city. And I mean, this it
is a really interesting bunch of environmental storytelling done very quickly and beautifully and elegantly.
Yeah, and I think there are things you go to games for, and there are things that you also go to games for. And if you really want to watch beautiful visuals, you'll go to films. You want that above all else. And if you really want the gameplay, you'll go to games. That's above all else. And I'm not going to be purist about this. There's no reason to say that a game is a air quotes better game because its gameplay is good and its visuals are bad than the other way around. You know, I hate that stuff. And there's plenty of room in the garden for all kinds of fucking flowers. But I've never forgotten her. So. Yeah, this is our cat who's guesting. Yeah, I've never forgotten Anna's reaction of, is it all like that? And I never really thought about that.
Yeah, that makes me quite sad.
I know, because
she has a point.
She does. And again, there's way more to Bioshock than that. There's a lot more wonderful visuals. There's an interesting story with a cheap and overrated payoff. And
hey now.
There's the Big Daddy boss fights are about possibly the only boss fights I've ever enjoyed because they're
they're much more frequent than I was expecting, because I took ages to play the original Bioshock games. I played Bioshock Infinite before I played the original, and so I was aware, as somebody who worked in games and played games, of the Big Daddy as this sort of character, and I didn't really understand what they were, and that they had this little girl with them, and yada yada yada. And I didn't realise that basically 20 minutes into the game you fight one of them, and then they just keep coming. And you can, I know you can have a choice of kind of avoiding the boss fights or going for it, and there's, it's cleverly done. But I think that's why it's more interesting, rather than sort of saying you have 3 hours in the game and then
there is, and because what they do is they set up each environment when you fight one as an arena, and you can choose when and on your terms to do it, unless you accidentally shoot one while you're fighting someone else, in which case everyone reloads. But there, of course, is your antagonist who isn't a villain, because the Big Daddies are extremely sympathetic because they're tormented souls guarding little girls, haunted little girls. But
yeah. So, in conclusion, we're saying games are rubbish and no one should go to them.
Yes. No,
I think
they put some things in me and I can't think straight now.
No, to be fair, I think you're absolutely right that the fact that there is a lot going on in a game in some ways detracts from the game specialising in a particular thing.
That's it, yeah.
So I had exactly this experience you were talking about. I just finished reading Dorothy Sayers' Gaudy Night, which I waxed lyrical about while I was reading it to you. And it was full of really nuanced, interesting stuff. And it's not particularly high literature. I think it is literature. I think it's excellent in lots of ways. But it's not like, Ulysses or something. But even though it is essentially a detective novel, it had loads of complicated, nuanced ideas about what it is to be human and feminism and how to be happy and all this kind of stuff. And I thought it was fantastic. Hooray, hooray, good for her. And then I sat down and played a game, which I won't mention because it was a good game and I don't want to give the impression that I'm being mean about it, but it was a game that had won a lot of awards. It's an indie game. It did actually have a young girl as the protagonist, and it had won lots of awards for being particularly intelligent about some ideas of mythology, and again touching upon complicated family relationships and what it means to be human. But I can't tell you the gulf in experience from reading even a detective novel, not a great work of literature, and then going to play what was being heralded as a really excellent indie game. I really felt that the landscape in the game, the sort of intellectual landscape, was really bare. It had one thing it was telling me, and I understood it very well, and it was interesting and compelling and well done, but it didn't feel complicated and nuanced at all. And I hadn't ever really directly compared the two experiences by playing a very high-rated game after reading a well-reviewed book. And it made me really sad, and I stopped playing it because I just thought, it's not really giving my brain something to chew on. And as you say, it wasn't because the game was badly written or because it was stupid or anything like that. It was a very good game in lots of ways, but because on top of the complicated story it was trying to tell, it had visuals that I was actually looking at with my eyeballs, and it had mechanics that I was controlling with my fingers, and it had sort of point and click mechanics, so there was mild puzzle elements as well. There were lots and lots of things that I had to think about, that they needed to leave space for me to think about in their storytelling, which meant that the storytelling had to be more simplistic to incorporate all the other stuff that was going on in a way that a book can be as complicated as you like, because all you do when you read a book is you sit there with your mouth open and your brain goes nosh nosh nosh.
That's exactly it. And I how bitchy am I going to be? Not very.
Be nice.
One of the complaints you will hear from video game writers is we're not paid enough attention to, and we could make the game story so much better if you just let us be in charge. Sometimes this is fair. Usually it's not fair. And my honest inclination is to say, if you want to make the story better in a AAA game about removing the noun I was going to use there, a AAA game of any kind, you're probably, not always, but you're probably in the wrong room. You probably want to go and write a play or a novel, or write for an indie game where the story can be the star instead, because there's a bunch of stuff in there, and not everybody's always interested in your words. And I think that's really the thing, is that the games don't specialise in the way other form of art specialise. It means they can do really interesting and unusual things by combining those forms, but it also means that very few of those, each one of those forms can't be the star. There's nothing to do with villains and antagonists, really.
Except that we can actually, because before I worked only with you in our tiny studio, in my previous life I was a game producer, and part of a game producer's job is to stop the different departments working on a game from being each other's antagonists, because every department thinks, rightfully so, that their department is the most important part of the game, because that's what they know, it's what they care about. So the artist is always going to say, give me another week to get my art even more beautiful, and it's going to make the game better. And the writers will always say, if it weren't for this stupid marketing department telling me I have to fit in all this stuff, my art could be, my writing art could be so much better. And you know, it's always, even, you know, the QA testers will say, if you let me do my job properly, I will make your game demonstrably better. And all of them have a point, because obviously that every bit of a game can always be better. But a lot of a producer's job is trying to get everyone to work together as a team and not actually get in each other's way, because, you know, unfortunately you have to work together as a team if you are a team trying to do one thing together. That's just a fact of reality. So yeah, I suppose we don't have antagonists in games, we try not to have antagonists in indie studios, and Nazis are bad. That's the conclusion.
Nazism is bad.
That's well, I mean, yes, because your point is that people should not be essentially.
Well, my point is, I was talking the other day about there's a poem that many of people listening to this podcast will know that begins, first they came for the socialists and I did not speak up because I was a socialist, and then they came for the Labour activist and I did not speak up because I was not a Labour activist, and then they came for the Jews and I did not speak up because I was not a Jew, and then they came to me for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. And this is chilling and effective, and it was a response to the Nazi regime in 1930s Germany. It's based on a sermon given from the pulpit by a man called Martin Niemöller, I think it's pronounced. I don't know. One of our Germanistas can correct my pronunciation. But the thing about Niemöller is that he had been a Nazi. I don't think he'd actually been a paid-up member of the party, but he'd enthusiastically supported Hitler and he supported the regime because he was a religious conservative, and initially the Nazis looked like they were going to squash all those damned communists and kick the Brits and the French out and restore Germany to its full glory, and also because Niemöller might or might not have had some anti-Semitic views himself, so he wasn't entirely unsympathetic to that strand of their rhetoric either. Yeah. But he changed his mind once he actually saw what they were up to, and he ended up spending the entire war in Dachau, although he survived.
Grim.
Yeah, and but he volunteered to be a U-boat captain as well.
Did he?
Yeah, when he was in Dachau. Now, I think you could cynically say, well, he quite wanted to get out of Dachau, whereas I think I want to get out of Dachau. But he said that when his country went to war, he wanted to do the right thing and he wanted to serve it. And yeah, so he was a Nazi and he wanted to fight for the Nazis. And I think if you ever find yourself quoting that poem, it's worth remembering it was written by a self-admitted Nazi.
Well, that's one of the things that I was reading about when I was looking up villains prior to talking about this. And there was a writer, who I can't remember the name of, who said that the traditional kind of stereotypical version of villains is less interesting to a modern audience, despite everything that you said to disagree with me at the start of this podcast, and you were right. But what we are interested in now is people who do things that are bad, but not from a desire to do evil, because I can't really, there are very, very few examples of people who have actually said, I wanted to do something that was bad. And this writer said the whole point of villains is that their motivation is basically the same motivation as the hero and the protagonist. Most people do things because they think it is right, or they think it is sensible, or it's what their friends are doing. Very few people do something because they know it will cause harm, or they know that it's a bad thing to do and therefore I'll do it. Usually there's a lot of justification going on. And your point about Niemöller is an ideological error, but he didn't know that Nazism would become one of the most horrific examples of what people do.
Yes and no. I think some of it, he didn't realise quite what would happen, but I don't think anybody could have listened to Hitler's speeches in 1933 and thought, well, he seems like a reasonable enough chap.
No, but my point is
but
that
he regretted some of his own choices and actions. It wasn't just that the mask was torn from the face. It's also that he reconsidered some of his
But it's also that it
decisions.
came out of things that in other contexts would not have been considered a bad motivation. So it sounds like he was very nationalistic. And a lot of people, and I don't mean this in a bad way, want to promote their country's interests. You know, that's fundamentally why we have a diplomatic service, and nobody would say that all diplomats are basically evil people. It's why...
speak with forked tongue.
It's why this country has made a decision to leave the EU, whatever you think about that. And I know it's depressing because we wish we hadn't. But that, for lots of people, came out of a sense of wanting to make Britain great again. And equally, you know, that slogan happened in America, make America great again, because a lot of people wanted to promote American interests. And now I'm not saying that those people were right or wrong or anything, but I am saying that this is an understandable motivation for people who are fundamentally wanting to promote their own interests in a way that is not obviously going to... You know what I mean?
I think the telling point there is that the motivations of villains are... our motivations, you know, seen from a different perspective. And I think the Second World War is a really good example of that, because if you were a German of good conscience in 1939 and you weren't aware, as most Germans weren't at that point of the Holocaust especially, you had the choice of fighting for your country or committing treason against your country, and I wouldn't have wanted to be placed in that position. And Hannah Arendt, the writer, intellectual philosopher, she attended the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in the 1950s. And Eichmann was one of the major architects of the Holocaust, and had been abducted by Israeli agents who were understandably cross with him and took him to Jerusalem to stand trial. And Eichmann's take was that he had tried his best to do the right thing. He'd obeyed all the rules, and he wanted to serve his country, and perhaps, you know, he was asked to do some regrettable things, but that was just his job. And psychologists who examined him said the way he was most unusual is that he was more into being normal than most people. He spoke in a lot of cliches, and he really wanted to fit in. And Arendt coined this phrase, the banality of evil, which has become justifiably popular since, and pointed out that at the time the myth was that all Nazis were sociopaths, and certainly some of them fucking were. But you can't have 500,000 sociopaths.
Yeah,
we've got over time, haven't we?
We got interested in sociopathy, and Chi is not happy about it, are you, Chi?
I've got one more bonus Nazi-related recommendation, which is Google Dorothy Thompson, Who Goes Nazi. It's an article I love with a macabre parlour game that you might enjoy.
Oh my god, is it like Werewolf, but everyone actually lynches somebody? Alright, well, I don't know what that game is, so I hope that it's not a horrible recommendation, but we'll leave it there, I guess. Have a spooky day.
Have a spooky day.